Okay. All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here. So it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our next moderator, Dr. Jeff Sutton. And Jeff, of course, I worked with Jeff for many years over the National Space Biomedical Research Institute and the Center for Space Medicine, of which I'm still a part of as an adjunct professor, so we still have a little bit of a connection here. But Jeff is definitely a fun guy to work with, knows a lot, as everybody here knows him. But let me read you his official stuff anyway. So Dr. Sutton holds the Friedkin Chair for Research in Sensory System Integration and Space Medicine at the Baylor College of Medicine, and where he is a professor and the founding director of the Center for Space Medicine. He was also the chairman of the NSBRI, as I mentioned, as well as the director, and also served as CEO, and he's currently the chairman of the board of the NASA Collaborative, the Translational Research Institute for Space Health, which is also at the Baylor College of Medicine. Prior to all of this, Dr. Sutton founded and directed the Neural Systems Group at the Mass General Hospital and Harvard MIT Division of Health Sciences and Technology, and his career has spanned several decades of research, education, clinical care, and administration, and his numerous awards and accolades and international recognition. We really don't have time to get into all those. So without further ado, let me please join me in welcoming Dr. Sutton.
Well, thanks very much, Leroy. This panel only has an hour. It's focused on radiation, and as folks know, there are three sources of space radiation. There's the trapped radiation within the magnetosphere. There's radiation from the sun, principally in the form of protons traveling near relativistic speeds, in the form of solar particle events. And then there's a radiation that comes from outside the solar system in the form of galactic cosmic rays. These are charged particles, protons, all the way up through iron and even as far as uranium. We're protected by the Van Allen belts, but beyond that, the SBEs and the galactic cosmic rays pose health risks. And given the limited time, it's going to be impossible to do justice to this very important topic, radiation, which is often considered the number one risk to astronaut health beyond low Earth orbit. But we're fortunate to have a fabulous panel of experts with expertise ranging from solar physics, radiation oncology, physiology, countermeasures, and other related topics. So the way that this will work is that each panelist will have an opportunity to give a sentence or two about who they are, and then to give some perspectives, and will allow enough time for discussion and questions from the audience. So why don't we begin with David Alexander?
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeff. I think the phrase yesterday that was used was odd duck. I'm the odd duck in this particular panel, in that most of the rest of the speakers are going to address what most of you are interested in, which is the risk to human spaceflight. I'm a solar physicist, have been for a few years, and I'm also the director of the Space Institute here at Rice, so I sort of get involved with many of you, at least the local ones here. And the thing I just wanted to bring in, although mostly, as we heard a little bit from Michael Barrett yesterday, NASA's really more concerned about galactic cosmic rays. Those are the ones that have the very large energies that are very difficult to protect against. And we feel that there's enough knowledge that we have that we can protect our systems and astronauts from solar particles. Solar particles are still important, and the sun's behavior is still important for many different reasons. You have to know that they're coming, right? They're not always there. So you do have to know that they're coming. They can add to your cumulative dose depending on where you are and when you're there. And so understanding how the sun is behaving, and in particular what we've been working towards, is predicting when the sun is going to do what it's going to do. And that may sound trivial, but it turns out to be very, very difficult, because not only do you have to predict an event, and we can tell that from, I won't go into all the details, I don't want to give you a lecture here or anything, but we can tell that by how complex the sunspots are and how they've behaved in the previous several days or even weeks. But we don't know what the nature of those events actually look like and what effectiveness they will have when it comes to radiation. Flare particles tend to be very energetic, but they're confined to magnetic fields there's a thing called the Parker spiral, but they're confined to magnetic fields in a very narrow path. Coronal mass ejections, on the other hand, which can be related to very large flares, tend to span pretty much 180 degrees of longitude, and they interact with the interplanetary magnetic field to create shocks, which in turn creates and we call them SEPs, SPEs, S little PEs, so we kind of mess up that part of it. Solar energetic particles, solar proton events, or solar particle events. And so we're trying to understand how all those things fit together so that we can not only predict that something is going to happen, but what the nature of that is, the kinds of particle spectra that it will produce and the energies that will derive, and on top of that, fold that into a potential trajectory so that it's not just about interacting what we call space weather, interacting with the Earth, but how it interacts with a particular trajectory to Mars, how these events affect the vicinity of the Moon or Mars. And I'll just finish with you may have seen in the news, we just launched the Parker Solar Probe. So we're actually sending a spacecraft into the atmosphere of the Sun. It will get to about 3.6 million miles above the surface of the Sun. And we think that's the region in which the solar wind is accelerated, but it's also the region where the CMEs interact with that solar wind to produce these shocks, to produce these particles. So we're hoping that whole combination of data and this advanced modeling that we're doing will essentially provide a tool for mission planners. I did want to say one other thing when it comes to galactic cosmic rays. So there's different cycles on the Sun, different time scales. What I've just talked about is the transient time scale. You don't know when it's going to happen, but you'd like to. But we also know that the Sun has an 11-year cycle, 22-year magnetic cycle, 11-year sunspot cycle. And when the sunspot is active, it actually acts as an extra buffer against galactic cosmic rays. And so the ability to predict the next cycle or the cycle after that is also very important for mission planning. The models are all over the place right now, but the next cycle will be next maximum will be 2026. The maximum after that will be 2037. We're starting to get into the ballpark that we're interested in. And so if we can predict the level of activity, it will help understand not only the potential for solar particle radiation, but also the potential impact on galactic cosmic rays. And so with that, I'll pass it on to the people who have to deal with them once they're generated.
So I'm a radiation oncologist. I'm also a radiation biologist. So most of my clinical practice is in patients with thoracic cancers, and much of my research has been on terrestrial and extraterrestrial radiation exposures and late effects, secondary effects, how to mitigate these. So for starters, we've been intentionally radiating folks for about 130 or so years. We've known that radiation can cause some pretty serious effect, including seeing cancer in radiation-induced ulcers fairly quickly, so approximately 110, 115 years since those observations. Despite that, with gamma rays and all that experience, we're still at a loss to describe exactly how radiation causes cancer, exactly what are the events, what does the immune system have to do with anything, and this is all at fairly robust and fast dose rates where we know the doses. We certainly know what happens. At low dose rate, it is significantly less clear for a lot of reasons. Low dose rate is not going to cause nearly as many events. We don't have nearly as many folks exposed, and you're doing a lot of extrapolation. When you add on to that the fact that a lot of what's going to happen to astronauts are going to be from heavy ions, so these are radiobiologically very different. They deposit energy in a much denser track that's potentially more damaging the DNA. It also may have more effects physiologically on cells that aren't targeted. So we don't really understand that. And then we're starting to understand genetic and physiologic risk factors. There are certain genes that we know in patients that lead to high rates of radiation-induced problems, but we're still learning. So I had a protocol looking at folks who'd had unusually severe radiation reactions. One individual had radiation for several different cancers and had just about every possible radiation complication, the kind of person who gets a colectomy after needing that from just simple prostate radiation. So very severe stuff. Did whole genome sequencing on him, and he had a mutation. He was heterozygous for a mutation at ATM, which is one of the double-strand DNA break proteins, that prior to that, our thought was one good copy is plenty. So there are people out there, and when I tell my patients with this, it's probably not that you have a 1 in 100,000 risk of, say, a cancer from the radiation. You probably have a 1 in 100 or a 1 in a million. I just don't know who you are. So there's that lurking out there as well. We have a couple of thoughts about time frame. Clearly, anything that happens during the mission, whether it's physiologic effect of radiation, such as synergizing with stress and other space factor environments on the hippocampal neurons that we know that have changes that occur during those sorts of spaceflight stressors already, to a very rapidly occurring cancer, which in a 3-year period would be a lymphoma or leukemia most likely, to increased risk of cardiac event or arrhythmia, which we now know higher dose radiation to the ventricle can actually cause arrhythmias in a very short time period, which we didn't think was possible prior to the last several years that we've been looking at some of our lung cancer trials. So there are those issues. Do those happen at low dose just because they happen at high dose? And then, of course, there's the more than 10 years out. When you've come back, you're on the ground. Certainly, it's very important to the astronauts, obviously, for their health. It's also important for the program. We're not going to continue exploring space if at year 9 from coming home, everyone has a fairly severe event that is not able to be fixed. Good news. Your lifetime risk of having cancer is about 40%. Your lifetime risk of dying of cancer is 20%. That's the good news in that a small 1% change in that represents a very tiny change in your overall risk, and your risk of death is 100%. Nobody gets out of life alive. So, other good news, I treat lung cancer. If you look at stage 1 lung cancer, our overall survival from 2001 to 2010 went from about 61 to 70%. Our overall survival up to 2018 is now in the 77 to 82, 83% range for stage 1 lung cancer. We're getting good at treatment, but I'm not that good. A lot of that has to do with our understanding that smokers are at a high risk of lung cancer, and we now screen routine high-risk populations. We catch cancer at an earlier stage. This is something we've only done with breast cancer prior, but it's probably going to be true with all cancers if we have an accurate screening. So I'll close with the idea, maybe what we need to do for cancer risk mitigation is not so much on the front end, but on the back end. We have a population of folks with succinate dehydrogenase mutations that are very prevalent to get pheochromocytomas and paragangliomas, very rare tumors, but they get them all the time. We now at Penn have a whole body rapid MRI screening program, doesn't use gadolinium, non-toxic, happens in about 25 minutes, and you can identify small tumors anywhere in the body easily. This could be done yearly on astronauts. It would be a fairly low-cost thing. Catching these cancers early, you could simply fix them and take that table. If you were worried about a 5% risk, you'd turn it in a 0.5% risk overnight. And that would be another effective strategy. Anyway.
Thank you. My name is John Charles. I'm a recovering physiologist. I retired from NASA and from the best job at the space agency, which was the chief scientist for the Human Research Program. I retired in February of this year. And as a free-range physiologist, I picked up a few little odd and end jobs, one of which was to be an advisor to a company that is developing a protective garment for radiation purposes, which is probably good because my insight into radiation and cancer is primarily as an absorber or a target for radiation and not really a student. So it's important to minimize my cross-section, and one of the ways we can do that is through a discussion of radiation mitigation. I'll sort of recap what I think I've heard over the last day or so and what we'll hear during the remainder of this panel. And I should say that I am the real odd duck here. Dave Alexander actually fits in very nicely, and I'm the unusual one. Ways to reduce radiation exposure to astronauts are from the biggest sense, well, the safest way to minimize radiation exposure is not to go, and of course that's not an acceptable option. But if you do have to go on a trip to Mars, you can go quickly, go fast, and we heard a discussion yesterday in a panel about possible propulsion capabilities that might get you there in less than 6 months. I think Dr. Barrett disenchanted us of the idea that we would have a warp core anytime soon, but we're probably talking about transit times of anything less than 6 months is going to be an improvement. You can also go when the sun is not active, if you can choose the right period of the solar cycle to minimize the probability of solar flares. If you insist on going whenever you darn well feel like it, though, you probably want to take the appropriate kind of mitigations with you, like shielding, and we can talk about shielding a great deal. You can shield your whole spacecraft, which takes a lot of mass. Even if you do even if you do dedicated shielding, it's going to be a lot of mass. It'd be nice to figure out a way to get shielding from the mass that you have to bring anyhow, and I think that's called parasitic shielding. Is that right? Parasitic? Yeah. It's the one time that parasites are actually good, I guess. And another way is to generate your own geomagnetic field if you possibly can. I think that takes lots of electrical power, though, and it's probably not something for the near term, although Dr. Chancellor may disenchant me of that idea. Another way to do things to protect yourself in terms of shielding is to have a dedicated portion of the vehicle available as something like a storm shelter. So when there is a bad solar event and there is bad radiation about, you can hide from it. And the Orion spacecraft, which NASA will be sending to destinations beyond low Earth orbit, hopefully in the not too distant future, will have such a storm shelter. I'm always amused to note that it is simply a storage bin which will be emptied, and the contents of the storage bin will be arrayed around the bin, much as we as children used to build sofa pillow forts. So they will build a little solar storm shelter fort and wait out the solar storm. And then there's the next step beyond that, or the next step lower than that, is something you might consider personal shielding. So this is an idea for shielding that doesn't have to include the entire spacecraft or even in a portion of the spacecraft, but just the parts you really want to shield, which would be the protoplasm that is flying the mission. And this is where I come in terms of the organization I'm advising. That company is called, I'm doing this as a disclosure, I'm advising a company named STEMRAD, which is building a device called the AstroRad. Let's see, it's called the AstroRad. It's a vest. It's a front and back worn vest, which would shield the most sensitive organs in the body from the most acutely dangerous particles of spaceflight. There are other ways to do that. AstroRad is using hydrogen-rich polymers as its construction material, but you could also, if you wanted to build a vest filled with water, that might be a way to do things. But the fun thing about the AstroRad vest being a personal shielding device is that it can be worn when needed and not worn when not needed. It will be tested on the International Space Station through a project sponsored through CASIS, the Center for Advanced Studies in Space. Is that right? Close enough. CASIS allows us to test this hardware on the International Space Station about this time next year, strictly for ergonomics and mobility. And then, most excitingly, this device will be part of the EM-1, the Exploration Mission 1, the first flight of the Orion spacecraft. Whenever it happens, hopefully in the 2020 timeframe, beyond low Earth orbit, it will be part of an experiment that's called MARE. MARE is a flight of 2 of the Matryoshka radiation-sensitive mannequins provided by the German Space Agency, one of which will wear the prototype AstroRad protective garment to provide actual in-flight data of the actual protective effect of this radiation protective device in what may be one of the few really controlled experiments we've had a chance to do in spaceflight on a sort of a whole body organismic scale. So this is very exciting. Perhaps one of the only shortcomings, or one of several shortcomings at least, one of the shortcomings of this particular vest is that it does not address a risk that Dr. Pulaski, our program director for the Human Research Program, mentioned yesterday, which is one of the things that keeps him awake at night, and that is the potential for CNS hits. of radiation. There is no hood provided with this vest yet, although I think that would be a fashion choice that perhaps I can recommend to our development team, hoodie versions of the Astrorad vest to protect even those organs. But the purpose of the vest is to, like I say, to protect the most sensitive organs, the blood-forming organs, the organs that contain most of the stem cells which are required for recovery from the radiation event. And it does so by using, as I mentioned, hydrogen-rich polymers in a component that is actually the basic unit is what's called a tessellated hexagonal shielding element. You can imagine honeycombs of these elements provided in this garment in a manner that is calculated to provide the most radiation protection to the tissues underneath while providing the smallest ergonomic impact. So this is one of many options for reducing the radiation dose of astronauts in deep space to prolong their effectiveness in flight and, of course, enhance their post-flight lifetime capabilities. And just sort of my sense at the 30,000-foot level of radiation and what to do about it in space. Dr. Chancellor?
Great. Thank you, John. I'm not sure how I'm going to follow that up. I'm not that funny, I don't think. But my name's Jeff Chancellor. I'm a applied physicist. I'm in the computational physics group at Texas A&M. I've been involved in what I call the radiation game for 20 years when I had a lot more hair, brighter eyes, and more optimism about what we're doing. It's been a long, long battle. Been involved operationally, program management, fundamental research, vehicle design, shielding analysis, all just about every part of it. I'm not sure what I can say different that I haven't said over the last 4 or 5 years here, but I do want to follow up on some things I've heard over the course of the meeting and maybe clarify and point some things out. So starting with David, I think some of the stuff you said up here was the most important things that have been mentioned in terms of radiation at the meeting. If we can't monitor the environment, especially autonomously, when we're sending crews to Mars, when all of our efforts or our mechanisms for predicting solar storms are focused on low Earth orbit, then we won't be able to protect the crew. And then when he mentioned the idea that we really don't understand the environment right now, we really don't understand the environment right now. We have no idea actually what we're talking about. We don't even know where the galactic cosmic rays are coming from. We can't really accurately predict solar particle events very well. It's still a problem that we've been struggling with for many years, mostly, for lack of better words, is radiation is hard. Matter of fact, one of the things he mentioned was the protracted solar min and the increased fluence of GCR particles. There have been models that have shown that actually is increasing the dose from 4 or 5 years ago upwards of 20 or 30%. So when you start looking at the fact that we approach this risk as a traditional radiation health protection program where we're just looking at the risk and we're either trying to shield it or limit our time in the field or limit our distance from the exposure, all of which we really don't have control over in spaceflight, you have to start reconsidering the fact that after 60 years and zero progress, we've never had a clinical diagnosis of a medical outcome from space radiation in the history of manned spaceflight. We don't have any biological countermeasures ever used or ever implemented into flight in the history of manned spaceflight. And we still have a lot of anomalies, like Dr. Single said, about how we approach the risk itself. Yesterday there was a paper mentioned where they talked about the gut biome being affected by galactic cosmic ray exposures and how it led to a cancer outcome. But when you really dig into the article, because I just read that one a few weeks ago, you start to realize that even though the methodology of this science and how they approached it is very sound, the interpretation starts to really become questioning. So when you have it wasn't a rat, I think they were mice, and they use what they call knockout mice, which are genetically engineered to be susceptible to the risk you're evaluating, and these ones were particularly susceptible to cancer. So it wasn't surprising to me that they got cancer after being exposed to radiation. And then you look at the fact that the paper mentioned there was an N of 10. But if you look at the fact that if you comparable dose in an astronaut population that have flown in space, and someone from CB can verify this, but I'm pretty sure an astronaut or cosmonaut is more physiologically similar to a human than a rat, it starts to really fall apart. When you start to look at the doses that they're saying that this occurred at, we have 150 astronauts who have been flown in the actual radiation environment exposed to these doses at appropriate levels, and we're not seeing these outcomes, like the cognitive risk, the cardiovascular risk, cancer. We're just not seeing any empirical observations. So maybe the only way we'll ever be able to move forward with this is stop treating it as a radiation protection program and looking at it as a medical outcome that we have to diagnose and provide actual clinical remedies for the crew. Thank you.
Thank you. I am Vyacheslav Ilyin, head of the Department of Hygiene and Microbiology of the Institute for Biomedical Problems. And now, in spring of this year, the process started dedicated to elaboration of conception of medical support of lunar program. And as a hygienist, I was faced with the necessity to determine the risks, existing risks, and proposed risks dedicated to the lunar program. So what is already proved and confirmed, it is what we call colonial resistant decrease syndrome, when three barriers which human organism built versus infectional agents is first of all a monolayer of protective microflora, then it is quality of the covering tissues, epithelial, endothelial walls, epidermis, and factors of cell and humoral immunity. So all of these three factors are diminished and weakened due to complex factors, including changed radiation level. And as a result, the cosmonauts start to be very active recipients of the exogenous microflora. It is, first of all, it is coming crew. Second is payload contamination. And the third is, and brand new issue, by the way, it is the risk of contamination of the external surface of the station during EVA. This is mostly interesting, more tough as to say, because it is these microorganisms are subjected to extreme environment, change radiation activity, and as an example, I can offer that we put these strains in the experiment called Meteorite. It is a piece of basalt in which we included about 200 different kinds of thermophilic strains, and and it burns while it is retrieval to the Earth. And the only strain which survived was that very Bacillus pumilus, which was isolated from this outer surface. So we can imagine how important these strains are, especially for interplanetary flights. Besides this, we also can face with some risks of interplanetary flights. It is, of course, meeting with indigenous microflora, mainly concerning of hemolithotrophs, but amongst these hemolithotrophs we must mention methanogenic and methanotrophic bacteria, as long as there was a traces of methane on the surface of Mars. And, for example, it also can be involved to the microflora of the space crew and may interfere or not interfere. It is subject for investigations. And how and the impact which can be performed is also under the investigations, and it can of course easily change their trophological preferences. How normally it is with the ISS or Mir station, when the saprophytes just by chance coming to the close environment change their properties and settled on the, for example, on the cable net, on the plastics, and so on and so forth. So, and the other, we can also foresee the problem if there will be expeditions one by one. So the previous expedition, we cannot exclude the situation when a certain kind of microflora can remain on the lunar surface, on the lunar environment, and having been phylogenetically compatible to human organism, it can perform also unpredictable changes, and therefore a new coming expedition may be suffered from the reinfection of that very pattern of microflora. It's the second, which also a very important factor. So what to do? Having just faced with colonial resistant decrease syndrome, we successfully tested the so-called autoprobiotics. So it is to enhance the first protective layer of the protective microflora, whenever it can be. It is intestine, nose, throat, skin, periodontal tissue, whatever. So, and this is for each of these biotopes has their own autoprobiotic strains, and now we have to launch the most thorough program to isolate the microflora. It is so microbial associations from different kinds of biotopes and store it in the deep cold conditions under minus 80 degrees of Celsius. And the idea is to verify how long it can be stored, whether we can isolate there the protective microflora, whether we can prepare probiotic based on that very microflora representatives and so. So what are the tools for investigation? First of all, it is a well-known program Bion M number 2, which will be scheduled on 2023 or 2024. It is the destiny is a bit foggy, but nevertheless, it allows to store the microflora inside the object. Of the satellite and in outside, so it can be exposed to the outer space. It will be 1,000 kilometers of radius of the flight. So it is not bad and very, very promising, very interesting program. In ISS as well, there will be certain kinds of experiments. So we will start experiment mutation, so it will allow to store microorganisms in special tubes with special containers of different materials which protected of different kinds of radiation. So we can also study this way. And as far as MLM will launch and dock to the space station. There are experiments allow us to learn the peculiarities of the microflora of the outer surfaces. Experiment test and scaphandre, spacesuit and expert. So, and of course we plan in vitro studies with microflora, how it is behaved, how it is can settle the intestinal microflora of the human beings, and using also simulation studies using artificial loops and any other hardware like this. So that's the risks and the problems. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeff, for inviting me for this panel. My name is Peter Norsk, and I'm the element scientist. Nobody knows what an element scientist is, I know that. So it's the lead scientist of the Human Physiological Research in the Human Research Program. I'm working under Dr. Pawlowski and reporting to Dr. Fogarty. And I'm very proud of that, by the way. And I'm also proud to be on the panel. And the bad news is I'm not a radiation expert. That's the bad news. The good news is that I'm probably on the panel because because of the Gateway missions and our plans to go to deep space, which is extremely exciting for me, we are integrating more and more from the human physiological side with other elements in the program, in particular the space radiation element under the leadership of Lisa Simonson, and with Dr. Williams in the behavioral science element. He's here today, and he's leading a very complicated integrated effort of understanding the combined effects of microgravity, isolation, stress, and radiation, all in combination on the brain and performance. And we are part of that from the human physiological side because we are responsible for the understanding protection for the sensory motor disturbances of spaceflight. Okay, so right now we are changing our program and approach. So when people talk, I would like to challenge the extremely famous and older participants of this audience in that we are doing things maybe not the right way as we should do in the past. I would say that we are beginning at least to do the right thing because we are adapting to the new circumstances, and that is, one word is important: integration. Integration of disciplines, integration from animal to humans, called translational aspects. We are trying to understand the body in relationship to each segment of the body, as well as the combined effects of the spaceflight environmental factors. And that's a new approach, because usually we've been segmented into columns in programs and approaches, and the challenge has been to speak to each other. We are doing that now. So Dr. Williams and I, we have offices just beside each other, and we talk every day about how to approach this problem. And I'm coming from the microgravity side, and he's coming also from the microgravity, but as well as from the radiation side together with Lisa Simonson. What are we actually doing? So we have selected experiments recently to animal experiments to understand a real, as accurate a simulation as possible of deep space radiation on the cardiovascular system. We are using rats. We are combining two experiments from Dr. Delp and Dr. Baker, very complicated issues, to understand whether deep space radiation compared to control cohorts combined with high-end suspension will actually induce inflammation in the cardiovascular system. Now, if that's the case, which there are indications that this could happen, we would be concerned about the smaller vessels, the structure and function of the smaller vessels in the heart and in the brain. Now, we know there's a relationship between cardiovascular disease and cognition. So if there's an effect of radiation on those vessels from radiation into the cardiovascular system, we are, of course, based on that, very much concerned about cognition, in particular in deep space. We also know there are recent publications. One is from Krukowski and co-workers from this year, 2018, in Science Report, that cosmic radiation in animals will induce cognitive deficits, and this is actually mechanistically induced by changes in microglia cells, and inducing neuroinflammation. So we know a little bit more now from animal experiments about the mechanisms, but the challenge is to translate that into understanding it in humans. So it's a huge challenge. It's very exciting, and Dr. Williams is leading a very, very, very complicated research program, but I think we are progressing well. So the vision is to, based on this research, understanding the mechanisms and the pathways in the brain, to being able to monitor astronauts in space through appropriate biomarkers and intervene or have intervened before it becomes serious in regard to performance and health. And that is a very big challenge, but I think we will succeed. It may end up that it's not a big problem, but we don't know. And in combination with one of the risks, the highest profile risk in my element is the SANS risk, spaceflight associated neuroocular syndrome. We have very, very recent, not yet published results indicating that the fluid shift, the chronic fluid shift from the lower part of the body to the upper part of the body, induces retinal thickness in the retinal tissues that is in a continuum, is progressing throughout a mission, and at a certain point it reaches a level inducing disc edema and maybe other structural changes in the eye. So we are getting closer to understanding the mechanisms of SANS. Now, edema or thickening of the retinal tissue, that is a kind of edema, exudation of fluid. So if space radiation or radiation per se actually increases the permeability of the capillary vessels, inducing exudation of fluid from the intravascular space to the interstitium, it would be a further concern for SANS to understand the space radiation effects, and it may aggravate the problem even further. And that is what is my greatest concern right now. Thank you.
I think it's evident that the depth and breadth of knowledge among the panelists is really extensive. And there have been questions regarding radiation that have come up in some of the other panels. And I think at this point, given the limited amount of time that we have, I just open it up to the audience to questions that they might have for any of the panelists at this point. Sure. Dr. Campbell.
Does anybody want to say anything about using spacecraft shielding using water?
Well, I mean, polyethylene is similar in shielding capabilities as water, and that's one of the things we use as a parasitic shield because of the way the ions align themselves and the ionization ability of polyethylene, which is very similar to water in that capability. It's one of the best shields you can use for heavy charged particles. As a matter of fact, a lot of the talk about like Dr. Charles mentioned, the magnetic shielding, everything I've read so far, they propose 15 to 20 tons or 30 tons of infrastructure, which is unfeasible for any exploration vehicle when you're still arguing about how many bananas and pairs of skivvies you're going to take to Mars. Let alone the redundancy and everything else you need to power that capability. And I would always argue I would take 10% of that mass in polyethylene and wrap it around the outside of the vehicle and go with that. But you're still not going to protect very well for the galactic cosmic ray. The CNS effects that they're presuming are going to happen, the cancer effects or the cardiovascular, you would be able to attenuate the solar particle, the off-nominal acute effects that could happen during spaceflight. It gets really complicated. You could actually add shielding that will increase the dose of the galactic cosmic ray spectrum. And even if you went to a shielding level that was probably twice as much of what we have on the space station floating in space, it would not provide a significant reduction in the GCR dose. Maybe 10%, I think it's been shown.
And I think maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, is that there's some work in the nano world where they can actually produce nanoparticles that are good free radical attractors. So it's a kind of secondary defense, I think, from some of these spallation effects coming in from the high Zs.
Right. So I think I know what you're talking about. I'm not exactly sure. My level of biology, I always say, is recreational at best. So I know enough to get myself in trouble or know when I need to ask Keith or you or something or Dr. Charles about it. But I do remember that most of the damage produced with heavy charged particles is not free radicals. It's mostly DNA and cell damage. So it kind of, I'm not sure of how much of a mitigator that would be. Yes.
Could you make a quick comment? You started to touch on it. If we have radiation shielding, the causing of secondary showers of particles from an inbound higher energy particle, you were saying it can make it worse.
Right.
Is there certain kinds of shielding, a little more detail on making it worse or not? Making the biological...
Are you asking what would make it worse?
The biological impact, cancer
Well, you're creating multiple fluents of neutrons, which are biologically devastating.
What conditions set that up? Is it, we are currently, what, 1/4 inch of aluminum if we went to 1/2 inch? Where is this? Get us on scale.
To protect it, how about 10 feet of concrete? Or 1,000 grams of shielding
I'm
like we have in the atmosphere?
Causing it to be worse, not
What's
protective.
Typically, well, so contrary to how we shield, like for clinical radiotherapy, like X-ray exposures or gamma ray exposures, you don't want more mass or a high Z material like lead or concrete that I was just joked about. The lower the charge of the material itself, the more effective it is at slowing down or breaking the particle up or absorbing it within the shielding medium. But even then, when you're talking about relativistic particles, things moving 80 to 90% of the speed of light, you need a lot of stuff to slow them down or stop them. Or else you're just going to slow them down enough so they range out in the body and are even more biologically harmful.
Take just a conventional capsule. One of the things being made now, even space shuttle aluminum. If you doubled it, would it be worse or better?
No. So the only thing we've ever launched outside of low Earth orbit that had humans in it was the Apollo vehicle, and it had the equivalent of half the shielding of shuttle and a factor of 10 less than what we have on the space shuttle, and a factor of 200 less than what we have here on Earth.
Half
So-
the shielding or half the thickness?
Does it matter? The
So
shielding
increased
capabilities. We
thickness
don't
means
evaluate in
increased
thickness.
shielding?
We evaluate it in its shielding capability based on how much mass it crosses as it moves
So
through the
it's better
structure.
to have more mass. You don't get worse by showering. The point being, if you killed the track all the way through and you don't have damaged cells, it might be better than having millions of damaged cells that go on and live in a shower. It's kind of where I'm.
Yeah, so if you let a single iron ion pass all the way through your body, you get one bad track.
Right, and it's
If
dead
it
and you're
collides
done.
with a nucleus in your shielding,
You
get 56 nucleons flying at you at 1 JeV or a fraction of a JeV, and now you absorb many of them, or you at least have
And the
56
cells
tracks.
live.
Yeah.
So where does this start to cross over, where more shielding goes from worser to better?
I don't remember exactly, probably somewhere near what we have on the space station. But we also have extra protection there because of the atmosphere and the magnetic field, and the fact that's just a big hulk of a shield.
So more shielding would be better.
So what I see what you're leading at, and I don't know if shielding is a solution because we're not going to be able to launch that much mass. I know I did
But
all of the
one could
blind valid
launch the
verification
mass.
for
Would you
Constellation
want
on the
to?
shielding, and we never met those requirements. So I don't understand how we've actually said we're going to meet them on SLS.
Yeah, we're missing each other's point.
Yeah.
I think one point of clarification too is that it's not just about how much shielding, it's what the shielding is made of, and I think that was Jeff's
Right.
point.
Right.
If you've got lots of hydrogen, which is where the water comes in, that's
Right.
that's a good absorber. So the polyethylene is a kind of
Then more is better,
you can create
always.
structures out of polyethylene that you can't create out of water. So I actually do the research into the kind of shielding you can get away with.
So is there any indication of what kind of shielding you don't want to have because more is worse? Is this making any sense to you?
thin high Z, thin high Z material.
Like aluminum, does aluminum get worse as you get thicker for a long time?
It's not as effective as polyethylene in shielding.
So aluminum.
So
yes,
you'll have
yes.
to- you'll have
I'm not looking at the
if you're
positive
saying
side,
the
it's the
equivalent,
make
if
it
you
worse
had
side.
10 gram per centimeter squared of aluminum, it is way worse than 10 gram per centimeter squared of polyethylene. And if you're looking at thicknesses, I think it's on the order of hundreds of gram per centimeter squared. So for those of us who aren't physicists, it takes me a moment to think about that. But if you think of water, a 1 gram per cc, then basically that's a centimeter path length through water. So you're talking 200-300 centimeters of water equivalent thickness, which
Is there any validity to the shower? You take the 0.9C iron nuclei and it makes a shower. Is there any validity to that being worse than just taking
Yeah.
the hit from the 0.9C iron?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because you're taking 56 nucleons plus whatever shattered off the nucleus that it hit, all of them taking velocities that are still plenty fast enough to make it through the rest of the shielding and penetrate into the body some distance. Worst
And allow
case
the
scenario
tissue
where
to
they stop.
survive and propagate as transformed tissue.
Or dead.
Dead might be better than transformed tissue.
It depends on how much dead. I think that's Princess Bride issue there, but mostly dead versus.
Thank you very much.
And a lot of it is we just don't know. We don't know what the clinical outcomes are from. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Lineker.
Could any of you comment on the efforts that have been suggested, at least, about pharmacologic adjuncts to shielding and whether they have any potential, at least, for being, as I say, adjuncts?
So I guess I'm a physician, right? So I can't heal myself. So all of the years we've got stuff, what we have is amifostine, WR2721, which was actually developed at Penn. Not used much anymore. I had patients beg me to take them off of it because the vomiting was so profound. So that's not been useful. There are, when you sit on study section and you look at grants coming through, there are a new nanoparticle that will save the day every minute of every day. There's at least some simple stuff, like I've studied flaxseed lignans. We actually tried those in radiation patients. The bad news is we're having trouble extracting the active component, and flaxseed is 15 grams of fiber and about 5 grams of oil for 30 grams of powder, which might cause problems with limited toilet facilities. So we're looking, but thus far there has not been things that are super effective.
Yeah, I'd like to fill on. So actually, flaxseed, we tested that many years ago. We supported them from our element, looking into radiation of lung tissue, and we did see positive effects and protective effects. So that's one candidate. I know the space radiation element is looking into aspirin in general as protection against oxidative stress and damage and other effects, anti-inflammatory effects that may be very promising as well. Is in the investigative phase. What I foresee, actually, we have received some interesting proposals recently, looking into all kinds of medication. Even some antihypertensive medication may have protective effects. There's all kind of random hypotheses that needs to be investigated. What I foresee for the future is that you would need shielding, of course, of certain type of shielding, but you need to know the PELs, the permissible exposure limits, in order to define the shielding. And based on that, you need to know the permissible outcome limits, which is one of Dr. Williams, who's sitting right up here. He's thinking about that every hour of the day. And we are trying to connect those dots. So, in order to define the minimum, what is the actual minimum shielding, combined with also what kind of nutritional components for antioxidative stress and damage handling, as well as simple pharmacological interventions that are non-harmful. So that's what I would foresee in the future as a combination.
I'll point out something that just blew my mind. A couple of months ago, I don't know if you all saw, the Aspire trial came out with low-dose aspirin for healthy adults with a low cardiovascular risk, Framingham risk less than 10%. If you looked at the byline on that, yeah, it kills people, which was a little scary, since it's supposed to be universally good and it's the wonder drug, and in mice it prevents cancer and everything else that can go wrong. The increase was due to cancer deaths. This is an anti-inflammatory, which, according to everything we've ever studied, should have reduced colon cancer risk at the very least. It wasn't bleed. There were more bleeds, but there weren't more bleeding deaths. The increase was almost entirely attributable to cancer deaths. Really set me back in my chair about what we know and what we don't know in humans. This is low-dose aspirin in healthy adults over 65 with a Framingham risk score, meaning a risk of heart attack less than 10%, who've never had a cardiac event, going from a 1 to, 1.5 or 2% risk of mortality, and that was almost all cancer deaths from an anti-inflammatory, all kinds. So it's...
So you're saying that people 65?
All I'm saying is, if you would have asked me how that study came out, I would not have quite bet my house, but I would have bet my and Jeff's car that it would have had a lower cancer risk. And I would now be walking to work.
Okay.
They're not dying of the cardiovascular events, so they die of cancer. Is that?
Maybe, it just scares you.
Dr. Fong? Kevin?
I may be misreading this, but it sounds a little bit like a council of despair on radiation for exploration class mission. I'm hearing shielding won't do it. I'm hearing power requirements for active shielding, no good. I'm hearing potential increase in fluence GCR by 20 to 30% for reasons unknown. And I'm hearing no biological solutions. So should we just pack up our exploration architectures that require us to be outside Earth's magnetosphere for more than 4 days?
No, if you're a solar physicist, it's a great thing for a solar physicist.
And frankly, again, like I said,
we should start treating it as an indigenous part of the microgravity factor. Microgravity itself and behavior nutrition has more impact to human health in space and to the mission success than radiation ever has. Radiation has never impacted mission success.
And I'll point out really quickly.
Ever.
For example, I know it's an idea I just had today at this conference, MRI screening. We can mitigate this risk. It's not going to, as long as it doesn't happen while you're on the mission, as long as it's a long-term risk, maybe we don't need to fix it. Maybe we just need to screen the hell out of them and do early interventions and get ahead of the problem. If you look at what happened in breast cancer, we were looking at left-sided versus right-sided breast cancer with older radiation techniques and older cardiovascular techniques. You increase the risk of death by a few percent for women, and so we never saved lives with breast cancer radiation. Our more modern series say that it increases the risk of cardiac event, but the cardiologist got so good in the interim, you don't die. Now you just get a cath and you get angioplasty when you have your heart disease, and we know to look and we know that to warn that woman you had left-sided breast cancer, be really aware of cardiac symptoms. And now there's no change in death. So maybe that's the solution.
So I am a little confused. So are we saying then that although we don't have a good delineation of the interplanetary risks of the radiation environment or its biological impacts, our best guess, were you to be asked the question today, before this decade is out, we want to be on Mars, would be it's not going to have a sufficient impact on mission during the mission for it to be an issue?
Well, maybe. And this is why I don't have a full head of hair anymore, because of questions like that. If you're talking about the solar particle event risk, that could have detrimental consequences to the mission success. But if you're talking about the outcome of cardiovascular or CNS effects or cancer effects during the mission, I think you have a higher chance of your former best friends who you just flew 4 months and the size of a volume the size of a closet actually eating you before you get to Mars and the radiation killing you. That's what I...
Thank you.
So I'd like to go back to Dr. Norsk's comments about antioxidants and Dr. Sengel's comments about the recent results from a study with them. It's been known for some time that giving large doses of antioxidant vitamins results in apparent activation or increased growth of tumors that might not have become bad tumors. So I would urge us to exercise some caution in planning on giving big doses of antioxidants as a solution. I suspect that there is a requirement for some kind of homeostatic balance with respect to oxidants and reductants in our systems.
Well, and counter to that, which is also interesting, Jim Mitchell, famous radiobiologist, made this observation early on in his career. Mice in germ-free environments, when you radiate them, don't really get cancer. So there needs to be some level of inflammation to lead to the outcome.
Yeah. Matthias.
Has anyone ever thought of something like a sandwich shielding? Because you said there's different types of radiation, and one shielding may be great for one type of radiation, but maybe, very harmful for another type. So, have a layer of water and then a layer of lead and another layer of water, something like that.
So there's some irony in that, because that's one of our main countermeasures is what we always refer to as the pilot shield. All the non-essential crew members hug the pilot to protect them from the radiation, because the pilot needs to survive that event so they can land the vehicle. That's no joke. That's what we did on the Hubble on STS-25, and that's what they've been doing since the Apollo program. So it's an interesting question. I don't think it'll change the outcome of the radiation, but there is some irony, because it is one of our countermeasures today after 6 years is still run and hide, or what we refer to as the pilot sandwich, jokingly.
And time for one more question.
So is this on? Yeah. If I've got the feel of the room, the audience is asking, is there a solution? And the panel is asking, is there a problem? Have we shown that there is a problem that needs a solution? And is it justified to intervene when no disorder has yet been shown? And what is really the definition of conservative when we talk about risk? If we spend $100 million to reduce the risk of radiation-induced cancer by 1%, and the same funds could reduce the risk of death by life support system failure by 10%, are we really being conservative in allocating our resources in that way?
I think before the biology folks get talking, I think There's two problems. One problem is, do we know what's coming? And that's part of the reason why I guess I'm on this panel. If you know it's going to rain, you take an umbrella. And so I think that's a useful tool to have to minimize some level of risk for the mission. It doesn't stop cosmic rays. It doesn't stop a number of other issues. So I think from that perspective, kind of minimizing the environment that you're working in, or at least knowing the environment that you're working in and knowing whether to go outside the HAB or the lava tube or wherever you happen to be residing. They do the same for EVAs. If they think there's going to be a solar storm, they will postpone EVAs from the space station, for example. I think the other problem, and this again as the non-biologist and what I'm hearing, is that trying to identify the lifetime risk, and we had a lot of this yesterday. Bonnie made a lot of comments yesterday from their discussions within her group, that the lifetime risk doesn't really account for all of the risks that people take during their lifetime. And so I think I'm hearing the sort of the same thing, is that maybe we treat the effects if they occur, as opposed to trying to prevent them occurring in the first place. But we should do all we can to minimize the risk of these problems to some level, maybe not as strictly as we're trying to do just now. And, but that's my tuppence worth for on that issue.
I also want to advertise the probiotics as a tools for improvement of the clinical state of the subjects subjected to radiation. So we have performed several studies on rats, which were investigated with different radiation level, and they were hung. So it was a sort of hypokinesia, and the subjects which obtained the probiotics has a better clinical state rather than which not obtained probiotic but was submitted to equal radiation level. Concerning the other studies, there were some experiments on monkeys, on macaca rhesus in IBMP, where we offered. There was an experiment called gamma breeze, so the animals were subjected to gamma radiation for a certain period of time, and again we offered there the probiotics and autoprobiotics, which were isolated from that very subject and returned back with the sour milk product to that very animals, and their clinical states was better than it was when they obtained simple sour milk product containing just lactobacilli from the collection of state collection, let's say, and of course rather better than which obtain nothing. So it was proved by several publications that probiotic has also some features which improve radioprotection of the subjects.
And I'll also point out there are data in humans on reversal of diabetes with fecal transplant. So, very early stuff, but not to be discounted that you are the symbiote on them, not the other way around. There's probably 20 times more of them.
I know that folks have microphones and hands are up for more questions, but unfortunately we're out of time. It's a very interesting and even at times entertaining panel, very informative. Please ask questions during the next break, and perhaps we could have a round of applause for the panelists.